The cottage looked smaller than it had in the photographs, but then again, everything about this place felt different from what Susan had imagined. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thanks so much for watching. She stood in the gravel driveway, designer heels sinking slightly into the loose stones, surveying the weathered wood siding and wildflower garden that had clearly been left to its own devices. The air smelled of honeysuckle and something else she couldn't name, something green and alive that made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't recognize. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Another email from the office. She'd been gone exactly 4 hours, and already her inbox was overflowing with urgent requests that somehow felt less urgent here, surrounded by rolling hills and the distant sound of water moving over rocks. She dragged her suitcase up the porch steps, noting the way the boards creaked under her feet. In Manhattan, creaking meant structural problems, contractors, and stress. Here, it sounded almost musical. The key her aunt's lawyer had given her turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a living room that looked like it had been frozen in time. Floral wallpaper, mismatched furniture, and windows that actually opened. When was the last time she'd been in a room with windows that opened? Susan set her laptop bag on the kitchen table and immediately began calculating how she could make this work. The Wi-Fi password was taped to the refrigerator in neat handwriting. She'd need to set up a proper workspace, maybe rearrange the furniture to create better lighting for video calls. Her assistant had already scheduled 3 meetings for tomorrow, and the Henderson merger couldn't wait just because she'd decided to spend the summer in the middle of nowhere. That first evening, she unpacked with the efficiency of someone who'd lived out of suitcases for most of her adult life. Business attire hung next to casual clothes she rarely wore, and her tablet and phone chargers claimed the bedside table like familiar territory. By 9 o'clock, she was back on her laptop, responding to emails and reviewing contracts, the cottage's rustic charm already fading into background noise. It was the sound of singing that first drew her attention the next morning. Susan had been on a conference call, pacing the kitchen with her Bluetooth headset, when she heard it drifting through the open window. A voice, clear and unself-conscious, carried on the morning breeze. She found herself moving closer to the window, phone conversation forgotten, following the sound like a thread. Through the trees that bordered the back of the property, she could see movement. Someone was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 oak trees, and they were singing something soft and country that Susan didn't recognize, but found herself humming along with anyway. "Susan, are you still there?" The voice in her ear brought her back to the call. "Yes, sorry, you were saying about the quarterly projections." But her eyes stayed on the figure in the distance, watching the easy rhythm of someone who belonged here in a way Susan had never belonged anywhere. The next morning, she decided to walk down to the small general store she'd spotted on the drive-in. She needed coffee, real coffee, not the dusty instant packets she'd found in the cottage's cupboards, and maybe some insight into this place that was supposed to be her refuge for the next 3 months. The store was exactly what she'd expected: narrow aisles, creaking floors, and the kind of personal service that made her feel both welcomed and slightly overwhelmed. The woman behind the counter was probably her mother's age, with silver hair and knowing eyes. "You must be Eleanor's niece," she said before Susan had even reached the counter. "I'm Martha. Sorry for your loss, honey. Your aunt was a wonderful woman." Susan nodded, clutching a bag of locally roasted coffee beans. "Thank you. I didn't really know her well, but she left you the cottage for a reason," Martha said, ringing up the coffee and a few other items Susan had grabbed. "Eleanor always said that place had a way of giving people what they needed." As Susan left the store, she nearly collided with someone coming up the porch steps. The woman was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of natural beauty that belonged in old paintings. Thick brown hair braided loosely over one shoulder, sun-kissed skin, and eyes the color of summer honey. She wore a simple sundress that moved like water and boots that had clearly seen real work. "Oh, I'm sorry," the woman said, steadying Susan with gentle hands. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Susan felt something electric in the brief contact, a warmth that spread from where their skin touched. "No, it was my fault. She gestured vaguely with her coffee bag, suddenly unable to remember what she'd been doing. "You're staying in Eleanor's cottage," the woman said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm Kate. I live just through the trees." She pointed in the direction Susan had seen the laundry line. "Eleanor mentioned you might be coming." "Susan," she managed, taking in the way Kate's smile seemed to light up the space between them. Yes, I'm here for the summer." "Well then," Kate said, stepping aside to let Susan pass, "I guess I'll be seeing you around." The phrase stayed with Susan all the way back to the cottage, and she found herself looking toward the trees more often than she should have, hoping for another glimpse of her neighbor. It became a routine over the next few days. Susan would work in the mornings, taking calls and responding to emails. But around noon, she'd find herself on the back porch with a cup of coffee, ostensibly taking a break, but really listening for Kate's voice or watching for movement through the trees. On Thursday, Kate appeared at her back door with a basket of vegetables. "From my garden," she explained when Susan answered her knock. "Eleanor always said the tomatoes here were the best in the county, but I've got more than I can use." Susan invited her in, grateful for the interruption, even though she had 3 reports due by the end of the day. Kate moved through the cottage with easy familiarity, clearly comfortable in the space. "Eleanor used to let me come over and use her piano," Kate said, trailing her fingers over the keys of the old upright in the corner. "I don't have one at my place." "Do you play?" Susan asked, then immediately felt foolish. Of course she played. Instead of answering, Kate sat down on the bench and began a melody that filled the room with something Susan couldn't name. It wasn't sad exactly, but it was full of longing, of spaces that needed filling. Susan found herself moving closer, drawn by the music, and by the way Kate's whole body seemed to flow with the sound. When the song ended, they sat in silence for a moment that stretched between them like a bridge. "I should go," Kate said finally, but she didn't move to leave. "You probably have work to do." "I do," Susan said, but the work suddenly seemed very far away. "But, would you like some coffee? I think I actually figured out how to make it properly." Kate's smile was like sunrise. "I'd love some." They talked for 2 hours. Kate told her about the town, about the seasonal residents who came and went, about the way the landscape changed with each month. Susan found herself sharing things she never talked about: the pressure of her job, the way she sometimes forgot to eat when she was working, the strange emptiness she felt even when she was surrounded by people. "Sounds lonely," Kate said, and there was no judgment in it, just observation. "I suppose it is," Susan admitted. "I hadn't really thought about it that way." When Kate finally left, the cottage felt different. Larger somehow, but also more intimate, as if Kate's presence had changed the very air inside it. That night, Susan found herself on the porch again, this time with a glass of wine instead of coffee. The evening was warm, full of the sounds of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. Her laptop sat closed on the table beside her, work forgotten for the first time in years. She could see lights on in Kate's house through the trees, and she wondered what she was doing. Was she reading? Playing music? Dancing around her kitchen the way Susan used to do when she was young? Before she learned that efficiency was more important than joy? The next morning brought rain, a steady drumming on the cottage roof that made Susan's planned morning jog impossible. She was surprised to find she didn't mind. Instead, she made coffee and sat by the window, watching the water run down the glass and listening to the sound Kate had called summer music. She was so absorbed in the rhythm that she almost missed the knock on her door. Kate stood on the porch, soaked through and laughing, holding a covered dish. "I brought you breakfast," she said, when Susan opened the door. "Figured you might not want to go out in this." Susan pulled her inside, grabbing a towel from the linen closet. "You're completely drenched." "It's just water," Kate said, but she accepted the towel gratefully. "It's actually kind of wonderful. When was the last time you were really in the rain?" Susan couldn't remember. In the city, rain was an inconvenience, something to be avoided or endured. She certainly couldn't remember the last time she'd seen someone look joyful because of it. "I have some dry clothes you could borrow," she offered. Kate looked down at herself, dress clinging to her frame, and seemed to consider it. "That might be good. I don't want to drip all over Eleanor's floors." Susan led her upstairs to the bedroom, pulling out a soft cotton shirt and a pair of yoga pants she rarely wore. "These should fit." "Thank you," Kate said, accepting the clothes. "You don't have to stay. I'll just change and come back down." But Susan found herself lingering in the doorway, caught by something in Kate's expression. There was a moment of charged silence, rain drumming on the roof, before Susan cleared her throat and stepped back. I'll go warm up whatever you brought." Downstairs, she busied herself with plates and coffee, trying not to think about Kate upstairs, trying not to imagine the soft cotton shirt against her skin, or the way her hair would look when she let it down from its rain-soaked braid. When Kate came back down, wearing Susan's clothes, something fundamental shifted. The sight of her in Susan's shirt, moving through Susan's temporary space, created an intimacy that had nothing to do with what they'd said or done, and everything to do with what hung unspoken between them. They ate the breakfast Kate had brought, fresh biscuits and honey from her own hives, while the rain continued outside. The conversation flowed easily, but underneath it was something else, a current of awareness that made every casual touch feel significant. "Your shirt is soft," Kate said at one point, absently stroking the fabric where it fell across her collarbone. Susan's breath caught. "You can keep it if you want." Kate looked up, meeting her eyes. "I might." The rain stopped around noon, but Kate didn't leave. Instead, they found themselves on the couch, ostensibly looking at old photo albums Eleanor had left behind, but really just talking. Susan learned that Kate had grown up here, that she'd left for college but come back because something about this place had called to her. She taught part-time at the local elementary school and spent her summers working her garden and helping at her family's farm. "Don't you ever want more?" Susan asked. "Career advancement, recognition, the excitement of competition?" Kate considered the question seriously. "I used to think I did. But then I realized that wanting more often means appreciating less. I like my life here. I like knowing my neighbors, watching things grow, having time to play music just because I want to." It was such a foreign concept to Susan that she almost couldn't process it. Her entire adult life had been built around wanting more responsibility, more money, more success, more recognition. The idea of being content seemed almost revolutionary. "What about you?" Kate asked. "Do you like your life in the city?" The question should have been easy to answer. Susan had a successful career, a beautiful apartment, resources that most people could only dream of. But sitting here in this cottage, wearing clothes she only packed as an afterthought, talking to someone who found joy in rain and garden vegetables, she couldn't quite remember why any of it had seemed important. "I'm good at it," she said finally. "That's not what I asked." Kate's directness was both disarming and refreshing. In Susan's world, questions like that were deflected or redirected. People didn't actually want honest answers about satisfaction or happiness. They wanted to hear about achievements and acquisitions. I don't know, Susan admitted. I haven't thought about whether I like it in a long time. Kate nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sometimes we get so busy climbing that we forget to look around and see where we're going. They were sitting close enough that Susan could smell the faint scent of Kate's shampoo, something floral and clean that made her want to lean closer. Instead, she turned another page in the photo album, trying to focus on Eleanor's documented life, instead of the way Kate's presence made her skin feel warm. That evening, Kate helped her make dinner, moving around the small kitchen with easy grace, while Susan tried not to get in her way. It was the first time in years that Susan had cooked something more complicated than reheating takeout, and she was surprised by how much she enjoyed the simple process of chopping vegetables and stirring sauce. "You're not bad at this," Kate said, tasting the pasta sauce Susan had been nervously adjusting. "Don't sound so surprised," Susan laughed. "I'm not surprised. You seem like someone who's good at whatever you decide to do. I just wondered if you'd ever decided to do this." They ate on the back porch as the sun set, candles flickering in the warm evening air. Susan's laptop remained closed inside, work emails unread for the first time in memory. The conversation ranged from books to music to travel, and Susan found herself talking about places she wanted to see instead of deals she wanted to close. "I've always wanted to go to Scotland," she said, refilling their wine glasses. "Something about the landscape and photographs, all that green and wildness." "What's stopping you?" Kate asked. "Time, mostly. Work. You can't just disappear from a law firm for 2 weeks without consequences." "Can't you?" Kate's tone was genuinely curious. "I mean, what would really happen if you took a vacation?" Susan started to explain about billable hours and client expectations, about the competitive nature of her firm, and the pressure to always be available. But as she talked, the reasons began to sound hollow, like excuses rather than explanations. "It sounds exhausting," Kate said when she finished. "It is," Susan admitted. "But it's also, I don't know, addictive, maybe? The adrenaline, the sense of being needed, the validation when you win. And when you lose." Susan was quiet for a moment. "There's always another case." Kate reached across the table and covered Susan's hand with her own. The touch was simple, comforting, but it sent electricity up Susan's arm. "I'm glad you're here," Kate said softly, "even if it's just for the summer." That night, Susan lay in bed thinking about Kate's hand on hers, about the way her eyes had looked in the candlelight, about the possibility of a life where taking time to watch the sunset wasn't considered an indulgence, but a necessity. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Susan still worked, but her schedule became more fluid, shaped around the natural cycles of the day rather than the arbitrary demands of billable hours. She started waking with the sun instead of alarm clocks, taking breaks to walk through Kate's garden, learning the names of flowers and the complex relationships between plants and weather and soil. Kate became a constant presence, appearing with fresh bread or herbs, helping Susan learn to appreciate the taste of tomatoes that had been picked that morning, teaching her to listen to the different sounds the house made as the temperature changed throughout the day. "Your aunt used to say that this place had its own personality," Kate told her one afternoon as they sat in the garden, Susan with her laptop balanced precariously on her knees while Kate weeded around the bean plants. "She said you had to get to know it slowly, like making friends with a shy animal." Susan looked up from her email. Do you think that's true? I think Eleanor was right about most things, Kate said, sitting back on her heels and pushing a strand of hair away from her face with the back of her hand. She said the cottage would tell you what you needed to know, but only if you were quiet enough to listen. I'm not very good at being quiet, Susan said. Kate smiled. You're learning. It was true. Susan found herself taking longer pauses between phone calls, sitting on the porch with her morning coffee instead of immediately diving into work, actually tasting her food instead of eating while reading documents. The change was so gradual that she barely noticed it until one morning when she realized she'd been awake for an hour without checking her phone. The transformation wasn't just in her routine, it was in her body too. The tight knot of tension between her shoulder blades began to loosen. She slept deeper, dreamed more vividly, and found herself laughing at things that wouldn't have registered in her previous life. And through it all was Kate, patient and warm and utterly present in a way that made Susan feel seen for the first time in years. One evening in mid-July, they were sitting on the porch swing that Kate had helped Susan hang between two of the old maple trees. The air was thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas, and Susan's work laptop sat forgotten on the porch table. I have a confession, Kate said, her voice soft in the growing darkness. Susan turned to look at her, noting the way the porch light caught in her hair. What kind of confession? I've been coming by more often than I need to. Kate's honesty was characteristic, but still managed to catch Susan off guard. The vegetables, the piano playing, helping with projects around the house. Some of it's real, but some of it's just because I wanted to see you. Susan felt something warm unfurl in her chest. I've been hoping you would, she admitted. Come by, I mean. I look forward to it more than I probably should. They were sitting close enough that Susan could feel the warmth radiating from Kate's skin, could count the freckles across her nose in the dim light. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and the sweet tension of something about to begin. Susan reached up and touched Kate's face, fingertips tracing the curve of her cheek. Kate's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment, before opening again to meet Susan's gaze. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as Kate's hand found the back of Susan's neck, fingers tangling in her hair. Susan felt something fundamental shift inside her, as if pieces of herself that had been scattered were suddenly falling back into place. When they broke apart, they stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. I've wanted to do that for weeks, Susan whispered. Only weeks? Kate teased gently. I think I started wanting it the day I saw you coming out of Martha's store, looking lost and beautiful and completely out of place. They talked until the candles burned down to stubs, voices soft in the darkness, hands intertwined. Susan shared things she'd never told anyone. Her fears about the emptiness of her life, her growing suspicion that success as she'd defined it wasn't actually making her happy, her terror that she'd wasted years chasing the wrong things. Kate listened without judgment, offering comfort not through advice, but through presence, through the steady warmth of her hand in Susan's, through the way she asked questions that helped Susan understand her own thoughts. What would you do, Kate asked at one point, if you could start over? If none of the expectations or obligations existed? Susan considered the question seriously. I think I'd want to help people, but differently than I do now. Not just corporations trying to make more money, but real people with real problems. Maybe environmental law or advocacy work. What's stopping you? It was becoming Kate's signature question, Susan realized. Not why she couldn't, but what was stopping her. The difference was subtle, but significant. Fear, mostly, Susan admitted. Fear of giving up something concrete for something uncertain. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of finding out I'm not brave enough to actually change. Kate squeezed her hand. Eleanor used to say that fear was just excitement wearing a disguise. When Susan finally went to bed that night, she lay awake thinking about the feeling of Kate's lips against hers, about the way her own body had responded with an intensity she'd forgotten was possible. But more than that, she thought about the conversation, about the possibilities Kate's questions had opened up, about the strange sense that she was finally moving towards something instead of just running away. The next morning brought a crisis at work, a client emergency that demanded immediate attention and threatened to derail a case Susan had been working on for months. She spent 3 hours on conference calls, her laptop overheating in the summer heat, her stress levels climbing with each new complication. When Kate knocked on the door around noon, Susan was pacing the kitchen, Bluetooth headset in her ear, gesturing frantically at someone who couldn't see her. "I don't care what time it is in Tokyo," she was saying. "We need those documents today, or the entire deal falls apart." Kate waited patiently by the door until Susan noticed her, then held up a basket and mouthed, "Lunch." Susan nodded gratefully and gestured for her to come in, then immediately turned her attention back to the call. "No, that's not acceptable. I'll get on a plane myself if I have to, but—" Kate's hand on her shoulder stopped her mid-sentence. The touch was gentle but firm, and when Susan looked up, Kate shook her head slightly. "I have to go," Susan said into the phone, surprising herself. "Handle it the best you can, and we'll regroup tomorrow." She hung up before anyone could protest. "Everything okay?" Kate asked. Susan started to launch into an explanation of the crisis, the importance of the deal, the way everything was falling apart. But as she talked, she heard herself, heard the frantic edge in her voice, the way she was treating this temporary setback as if it were a matter of life and death. "Actually," she said, stopping mid-sentence, "I have no idea. It felt like everything was okay a minute ago, but then this call came in, and suddenly it was like I forgot where I was, who I was becoming here." Kate set the basket down and pulled Susan into a hug. The simple human contact was enough to slow Susan's racing heart, to remind her that she had a choice about how to respond to whatever was happening at work. "Want to go for a walk?" Kate suggested. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to stop thinking about it for a while. They walked through the hills behind the cottage, following paths that Kate knew by heart. Susan's phone buzzed constantly in her pocket, but she didn't check it. Instead, she focused on the way the tall grass brushed against her legs, the sound of Kate's voice as she pointed out wildflowers and told stories about the land they were walking through. "My grandmother used to bring me here when I was little," Kate said as they reached a clearing with a view of the valley below. "She said this was the place to come when you needed to remember what was real." Susan looked out over the patchwork of fields and forests, the distant mountains hazy in the summer heat. What did she mean by real? "I think she meant the things that matter when everything else falls away. Family, love, beauty, the feeling of being connected to something bigger than yourself." Standing there with Kate beside her, phone silent in her pocket, and work crisis relegated to background noise, Susan thought she was beginning to understand. That evening, she called her assistant and asked her to reschedule the next day's meetings. She turned off her laptop earlier than she had in weeks and spent the evening cooking dinner with Kate, learning to make bread from scratch, their hands covered in flour and their conversation punctuated by laughter. "I keep thinking I should be more worried about work," Susan said, as they waited for the bread to rise. "But I can't seem to make myself care as much as I used to." "Maybe that's not a problem," Kate suggested. "Maybe that's growth." They made love that night for the first time, slow and tender and full of discovery. Susan learned the geography of Kate's body, the freckles on her shoulders, the way she gasped when touched in certain places, the graceful arch of her back in pleasure. Kate was patient and generous, guiding Susan through the unfamiliar territory of vulnerability, of giving and receiving not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, windows open to let in the night air. Susan traced lazy patterns on Kate's bare shoulder, marveling at the softness of her skin, the perfect fit of their bodies together. "I've never," Susan started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Never what?" Kate asked gently. "Never felt this connected to someone. Never felt like someone saw me, really saw me, and wanted me anyway." Kate turned in her arms so they were face to face. "What do you mean, anyway?" "I don't know. I guess I always felt like I had to earn love, like I had to achieve something or be impressive enough to deserve it. This feels different, like you see all my flaws and uncertainties and you're here anyway." "Not anyway," Kate corrected softly. "Because. I'm here because of who you are, not despite it." It was a revelation that Susan carried with her through the weeks that followed. As summer deepened, she found herself changing in ways that went beyond routine or stress levels. She began to see her work differently, questioning not just how much time she spent on it, but why she was doing it at all. She started researching environmental law firms, reading about attorneys who'd left corporate practice to work on conservation cases or climate change litigation. She found herself drawn to stories of people who'd given up high salaries and prestigious positions to do work that aligned with their values. "I've been thinking about making a change," she told Kate one evening as they sat by the small pond on Kate's property, watching fireflies begin to blink in the gathering dusk. "What kind of change?" "Leaving the firm. Maybe starting over with something that feels more meaningful." Susan paused, pulling up a blade of grass and twisting it between her fingers. "It's terrifying. I'd be giving up everything I've worked for." "Or," Kate said thoughtfully, "you'd be trading something that doesn't fit anymore for something that might." They talked through the practical considerations, the financial implications, the professional risks, the possibility that Susan might hate working for less money on cases that felt more important. But underneath the practical concerns was something else. The growing certainty that the life she'd built in the city was no longer the life she wanted. August brought a heat wave that seemed to press down on everything, making the air shimmer and the afternoons feel endless. Susan's work slowed to a manageable pace, and she found herself spending whole days without thinking about billable hours or client expectations. One particularly sweltering afternoon, Kate appeared at her door with a proposition. "There's a swimming hole about a mile upstream," she said. "Water's clean and cold, and nobody ever goes there. Want to escape the heat?" They hiked through the woods, following a creek that bubbled over smooth stones and created small pools in the shadows of overhanging trees. The swimming hole was exactly as Kate had described, a deep, clear pool fed by a small waterfall, surrounded by flat rocks perfect for sunbathing. Kate stripped down to her underwear, without self-consciousness, and waded into the water with a sigh of relief. Susan followed more cautiously, gasping at the cold shock of mountain water against her overheated skin. They floated together in the center of the pool, looking up at the canopy of leaves overhead, the sun filtering through in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Susan felt completely present in her body for the first time in years, aware of the water against her skin, the play of light on Kate's face, the sound of the waterfall mixing with their quiet conversation. "I want to tell you something," Susan said, as they drifted near each other. water lapping gently around them. Kate reached for her hand underwater. What? I've decided to leave the firm. Kate's expression didn't change, but her grip on Susan's hand tightened slightly. Are you sure? No, Susan laughed. I'm terrified, but I'm sure that staying would be worse than leaving. I'm sure that I want to try doing work that matters to me, even if I fail at it. You won't fail, Kate said with quiet certainty. How can you be so sure? Because you're brave enough to try. That's already more than most people manage. They kissed there in the water, surrounded by the sound of moving water and birdsong. And Susan felt something settle in her chest. Not just desire, but a deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged. That night, Susan called her senior partner and submitted her resignation. The conversation was difficult, full of warnings about career suicide and the impossibility of returning to corporate law once she'd left. But as she talked, Susan felt lighter with each word, as if she were shedding a weight she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. What will you do? Kate asked afterward. As they celebrated with a bottle of wine Eleanor had left in the cottage's small wine cellar. I'm not sure yet. I've been in touch with some environmental groups, and there's a legal aid clinic in the state capital that might need help. Nothing's definite, but for the first time in years, I'm excited about the possibilities instead of terrified by them. Kate raised her glass. To possibilities. To possibilities, Susan echoed, and meant it. The last weeks of August passed too quickly. Susan threw herself into the process of unwinding her old life and imagining her new one. She had conversations with environmental lawyers who talked about the satisfaction of protecting wild places and fighting for sustainable policies. She researched nonprofits that needed legal help and found herself energized by their missions in a way corporate law had never managed. But underneath all the planning and preparation was the growing awareness that summer was ending, and she would have to leave this place, leave Kate. They didn't talk about it directly at first, but the approaching separation hung between them like a cloud. Susan found herself memorizing details, the exact shade of Kate's eyes in morning light, the sound of her laugh when she was truly delighted, the way she moved through the world with such natural grace. One evening in late August, as they walked through Kate's garden, picking tomatoes for dinner, Kate finally brought up what they'd both been avoiding. Have you thought about what happens when you go back? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Susan stopped walking, a sun-warmed tomato in her hand. I've thought about it constantly. And I don't want to go back. Not to the old life anyway. Susan turned to face Kate fully. I know we haven't talked about the future, and I don't want to assume anything, but I'd like to try to build something new. Here, if you'll have me. Or wherever you are. Kate's smile was like sunrise. I was hoping you'd say that. Really? Really. I've been trying to figure out how to ask you to stay without making it sound like I was asking you to give up everything you've worked for. You're not asking me to give up anything important, Susan said, stepping closer and taking Kate's hands in hers. You're asking me to choose what matters. That night, they made plans. Susan would go back to the city only long enough to pack up her apartment and finalize her resignation. She'd already found a small environmental law firm based in the state capital, an hour's drive from the cottage, that was interested in hiring her. The pay would be a fraction of what she'd made at the corporate firm, but the work, protecting watersheds, fighting development that threatened wildlife habitats, helping communities affected by pollution, felt like purpose in a way that mergers and acquisitions never had. I want to keep the cottage, Susan said, as they lay in bed that last night, Kate's head on her shoulder. If that's okay with you. I know it's presumptuous, but it feels like home now. It is home, Kate said softly. Eleanor would be so happy to know that someone who loves it as much as she did is going to take care of it. How do you know I love it? Kate lifted her head to look at Susan. Because you love me, and this place made me who I am. Because you've changed here, become more yourself than you were before. Because when you talk about staying, your whole face lights up. Susan pulled her closer, overwhelmed by the simple truth of it. She did love this place. The cottage with its creaky floors and surprising morning light. The garden that was teaching her patience. The hills that had shown her what quiet looked like. But more than that, she loved the person she was becoming here. The woman who had time to notice fireflies and taste tomatoes, and fall in love with someone whose values aligned with her own heart. I love you, she said, the words easier than they'd ever been with anyone else. I love you too, Kate replied, and Susan could hear the smile in her voice, even in the darkness. Susan left the cottage on a Tuesday morning in early September, her car packed with the few belongings she'd brought and the even fewer she was taking back. Kate walked her to the car, their fingers intertwined, both of them trying not to make it feel like a goodbye. 2 weeks, Susan said, though they'd already confirmed the timeline a dozen times. 2 weeks, Kate agreed. I'll take care of the garden while you're gone. Take care of yourself, too. You too. And Susan? Kate leaned through the car window to kiss her one more time. Don't let the city convince you that this wasn't real. As Susan drove away, the cottage growing smaller in her rearview mirror, she carried with her not just the memory of the summer, but the certainty of its realness. She'd found something here that she'd been looking for all her adult life without knowing it. Not just love, but purpose. Not just success, but satisfaction. Not just achievement, but peace. The city, when she returned to it, felt like a place she'd visited in another lifetime. The noise that had once energized her now seemed overwhelming. The pace that had once thrilled her now felt frantic and hollow. She moved through her old routines, packing boxes, meeting with clients for final handovers, saying goodbye to colleagues who looked at her with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. But she did it all with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was going. 2 weeks later, she drove back through the hills toward the cottage, her car packed with the pieces of her old life that still mattered, and the promise of a new one that fit like clothes, made just for her. Kate was waiting on the porch when she arrived, and the sight of her, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a sundress the color of summer sky, made Susan's heart race with the same intensity it had that first day at Martha's store. Welcome home, Kate said, and Susan knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged.